Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering devotion to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. For your viewership, companionship, and unceasing support, dear listener, I wholeheartedly thank you. I'm so grateful that you've decided to tune into my modest little channel, on which you'll soon discover the internet's best conversations are furtively being held. I'm joined today by a man of prodigious intellect and manifold talent with whom I've long wished to have a chat. Today marks the fulfillment of that wish. Dan Willingham is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, at which he's taught since the year of my birth, 1992. Initially, the focus of Professor Willingham's research was on the brain basis of learning and memory, topics into which we'll no doubt delve. Today, his focus has shifted to the application of cognitive psychology to K-16 or K through 16 education. Professor Willingham is the author of multiple fine books, most notably his best-selling 2009 work, Why Don't Students Like School? A question we've all asked ourselves. And more recently, Outsmart Your Brain, onto which I was very eager to get my hands once it was available at the library, and which I'll soon make a purchase of through Amazon. An undisputed expert in his field, Professor Willingham was appointed by President Obama to serve as a member of the National Board for Education Sciences. I'll not strain the patience of my listeners any longer by enumerating all the other accolades with which you've been so deservedly showered. Professor Willingham, Dan, thank you so very much for agreeing to join me today.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So I want to begin with my favorite activity than which I think there's none more satisfying, and that's reading. I fear that our society, while technically literate on the whole, doesn't actually know how to read. That is, how to read for comprehension. An intellectual hero of mine, Mortimer Adler, sought to redress this problem many years ago when he wrote his instructive little work entitled, simply enough, How to Read a Book. In it, he outlines 4 levels of reading through which one can progress until he or she masters the art. Now, you suggest a different strategy in your book. You call it, or it's called SQ3R, which sounds like it could be the adorable companion of a Star Wars drone. So if you would, tell us the best way we should approach reading if we're to do so not merely to pass the time, but truly to learn and to possess the material before us.
Yeah, and so to be clear, SQ3R is not my invention. I actually don't know who came up with this, but it's probably the most common of a family of strategies. And I should also mention, I think that there are, we read for different purposes, and there are different conventions in different disciplines regarding how to read. So SQ3R is, again, one of a family of strategies that's useful to make sure that students have a relatively basic understanding of what an author has tried to communicate. It's not the kind of thing that you would be taught in an English class, for example. And I think Adler is talking much more about how to read a work of prose fiction or a poem, perhaps. It's not the way you would tackle, it doesn't have anything about the conventions of reading that scientists use or that historians use. But what it's really meant to do is to keep a student's attention focused on what they're reading. We've all, of course, had the problem of, you feel like you're reading, your eyes are tracking, but you get to the bottom of a page and you realize, I haven't been thinking about the content of this at all. My mind has just been elsewhere. So it's meant to minimize the frequency of that happening. And then again, also to help you sort of understand at a relatively comprehensive level. So all of these strategies, I won't get into the details of SQ3R in particular, because I don't think that one's especially important. But all of these strategies ask you to do some sort of preparation, some sort of anticipation of what it is that you're going to read. And that's usually in service of setting some sort of a goal for yourself. That's very important, because there is research showing that the mindset that you have going into reading something really does affect the way that you read and understand it. So typically what you want to do, if you're a student and you're doing a typical sort of student-y reading, you're reading a textbook, or it's going to be nonfiction, it's going to be technical, it's going to be content that's new to you. The idea is that you set yourself some questions related to, what am I expecting to learn from this? So probably the best way to figure out what those questions ought to be is you look at the title, you look at the headings and the subheadings, and from that, I think the example I gave in the book was something like David Marr's philosophy of science. Like, if that's one of the headings, then you think to yourself, all right, like, I'm going to find out what his philosophy of science was, and perhaps compare it to other ideas about that topic, and so on. So you start off with those questions, and then as you're reading, you're trying to answer the questions. And of course, it's possible that you set yourself bad questions that are not real. You're guessing. You haven't read yet. So that's one thing you might figure out as you go is, these actually weren't very good questions. So you're trying to determine whether or not they're good questions. And if they are good questions, what are the answers to those questions?
And would you say it's important for the reader, him or herself, to establish those questions? Does it sort of invest him or her in the process?
I think it's useful for sure. I mean, part of it too is that, so I guess implicitly you're asking, if the author provides questions beforehand, should you use those? It's probably not a terrible idea to use them, but another thing you could do if you want to still reap some of the cognitive benefits, you could look at do the scanning that I described and say, okay, now I'm going to look at the author's questions, having done that scan. Are these the questions that I would have come up with? Maybe your questions are pretty good too, right? In addition, so no reason not to use those as well.
Yeah. I think that it puts a little flesh into the game when you become as active a participant as possible in the reading process. So far as I can understand. With that being said, there's a fair amount of pre-planning, right? You want to enter into a reading project or an experience somewhat strategically, at least when it's a work of nonfiction. But while you're immersed in the reading process, tell us, what are some of the activities that are most beneficial for the retention of the information while you are immersed? Should you take marginal notes? Should you highlight, underline? Should you make note cards contemporaneously to which you can return later on?
There's lots and lots of research on highlighting, and highlighting is not very effective. It's by far the most common activity that people engage in. And it's easy to see why people would do that. It doesn't cost you very much. It's relatively easy to do. And it feels like you're saving time later. You're saving future time because you know what you should return to. But what the research indicates is that people are not very skillful in their highlighting. They tend to highlight facts and definitions. And it's easy to see why that would be. People, there's no reason to expect that if you're reading something that's new to you and is pretty challenging and technical, that you're going to understand it all that deeply the first time that you read it. So highlighting might be fine if you already have a fair amount of expertise in something, and a new document or reading comes your way, then highlighting probably makes sense. But if you're a relative novice, as you usually are when you're a student, you're better off taking notes. You could do it on note cards. I mean, I think this is an instance where taking notes electronically probably makes sense, because you're probably going to want to edit them later. As you learn more and revisit those notes, you're probably going to want to change things around as your understanding gets deeper. So that's one thing. There are two things I would suggest you really focus on. Taking notes is definitely a good idea, and that's the format in which I would think about doing it. The second thing that people tend not to do when they read is to coordinate meaning across paragraphs and across sections. They tend to read sort of sentence by sentence, and if they're understanding each sentence, their sort of self-evaluation of their comprehension is pretty good. They figure, like, I'm getting it. Every sentence is making sense. And what they're not doing is pausing a moment and thinking, okay, so what did this whole paragraph mean? And how do I interpret that in light of everything I've read in this section up until now? And then same thing when you complete a section. What was the big, you get to the end of the David Marr philosophy of science. Go, okay, so what was his philosophy? And why did the author talk about that? Am I supposed to contrast that with, the previous section, or where does that fit into the larger message? That sounds like, gosh, that seems like a lot of work. And it is, right? I mean, like, you can't expect that you're going to come to deep understanding without doing that work. But that's probably what you're supposed to get out of the text. And so you got to do that work sometime. It's not going to be easier later, right? So you may as well do it now.
Right. And I think a lot of times students are misled by the assignment. They're told, okay, well, you must read chapter 3 on the topic of whatever it might be. So they think, okay, that's 10 pages in length. That'll take me about this amount of time. So let's read it. But the really, truly strategic and comprehensive way might be, okay, paragraph by paragraph, annotated at the end. I think Benjamin Franklin used to talk about, how he would come to an understanding of a certain text. And he wasn't formally extensively schooled, but he would annotate at the end of, a section, a passage, or even a single paragraph. And then, at the very end, at the conclusion of the text or of the chapter, bring everything together and consolidate it. It's funny when you mention highlighting. I mean, I'm still a bibliophile. I have tons of books, used books, typically for the inexpense of them coming into my house from Amazon, and I often receive them marked almost to a point of indecipherability with highlighter, with highlighter, and it's like a palimpsest. In some ways, there's something kind of neat about receiving someone else's, or what was someone else's treasure, which they certainly let go all their thoughts and their scribbles and their highlighter marks. But I think it also leads the student to think that there's something important here that he's missing. I've often found that to be the case. I'm reading a passage, and I like to think I'm a more discerning reader, and I'll read a passage that's vigorously highlighted, almost such that the ink is pouring through the other side. And it's like an inconsequential passage. And I think in your book you talk about this, the fact that when they did their research, they went into the bookstore, they looked at a multitude of books and found that the highlighted sections were often, of some import, but certainly not of central importance to the message of the work. So beware anytime you receive a book secondhand or used. If it's highlighted, it might actually be worth reading. Let me ask you, there's always a debate amongst readers and maybe students as well about how to approach the sanctity of a book, right? I've heard it described as a carnal approach or a more chivalrous approach. I just read that recently. Now, I, for one, I'm pen in hand, pencil in hand, underlining, writing in the margins. I'm very active in my reading, and that's something that I've adopted through the course of time. I find it to be most conducive to the retention of the information. But some people treat their books with a greater sense of purity than I do. So tell me, you personally, are you more of a carnal reader or a chivalrous reader?
I'm more of a carnal reader. And like you, I think that's, I don't know of any research on this topic. So I don't have any guidance that way. And so I encourage students to sort of experiment a little bit and see what feels right to you. And I've tried various things, but I tend to take most of my notes in the back of the book. And then I have page numbers, annotates what the note goes with. And I might put a tick mark here and there, but margins usually aren't big enough. If I got something I want to write down, if I try and squeeze it into the margin, I won't be able to read it later.
Yeah. The only trouble is when the publisher constrains you with only a few back end pages of which to make.
Stingy publishers, it's really a problem.
It's an issue. Yeah. So what I'll usually do is I'll usually write, depending on how limited that space really is, I'll write the new vocabulary words or just like big phrases or terms that can be researched, and I try as best I can to write in the margins because I have kind of faint and dainty little handwriting, so it usually works well enough for me.
But the other thing, Daniel, that I have a problem with is that then I can't readily find all of my notes, because all I'll remember is, I had some interesting observation that was to do with creativity or something. I think it was this in this book. That may be as much as my memory gives me. So if all of my notes are in the back of the book, then it's very easy for me to check. But if they're in the margins, then there's a cost.
Oh, well, then that's when I dog ear the page.
Wow, you are super carnal. Your books are a mess.
Oh my gosh, carnal too. It's embarrassing. I shouldn't be in civil society with how carnal my approach is.
Not in my books anyway.
But it's funny how we all sort of establish, if we're devoted readers, we all sort of establish our own approach. So mine is like, marginalia. And then if it's really important, it gets a star. And if it's extremely important, it gets a star, an asterisk with a circle around it. And if it's supremely important, it gets the dog ear fold. And that's when I know it's a page to which I just have to return at some point later on. Yeah. But I'll have to adopt your technique. Do you ever take pictures with your phone of an entire page or a passage and maybe store them in an electronic archive of some sort?
I've done that, and I find I tend not to consult those notes. I think there's a false, for me anyway, I end up with a false sense of having really captured something important. And then I've essentially offloaded the memory to an electronic device, and then I just lose track of it and I don't consult it again.
Yeah, much like the photographs that we take on our on our iPhones and our Androids, they immediately vanish into the ether if not shared with a friend. Now, you mentioned in your book that rereading a particular chapter or the entire text doesn't really aid in your comprehension of the material. Now, you might think that rereading strengthens your ability to recall, much in the same way that a biceps curl might increase the strength of your arm, but it seems not to be the case. So I ask you, why is it that rereading a passage or a text is of so little benefit? And what are some of the other mistakes we make when trying to grasp a text?
So you actually said two different things there, and it's a very important distinction to make. Rereading does help comprehension, or can help comprehension. So in other words, if you read something and you think, I didn't really get that section very well, absolutely you should reread it and try to be resourceful in coming at it a different way. Was there vocabulary you didn't get? Was there some syntax that was difficult to unravel? Do you need to, maybe you need a little bit of background knowledge on this topic, even if you know the vocabulary. There's some background that you're missing. And so rereading is a good idea there, but rereading does not help memory nearly as much as people expect it to. Our expectation is, and this is the most common study strategy that students use, is they reread their textbook, they reread their notes. And rereading leads to an increased sense of familiarity. So familiarity is a type of memory, but it's not the type of memory that will support the type of recall that you're going to be expected to do on a test. Psychologists use the term familiarity the way it's used in everyday conversation. When I say Daniel looks familiar or that guy looks familiar, I mean I can't tell you anything else about him other than that I've seen him before. And so familiarity is that type of memory, and that's the type of memory that rereading really boosts. It it makes things feel more, as you're reading, everything feels more fluent. And therefore, that's easily mistaken for like, oh yeah, no, I got this, no problem. I've read this a million times. This is easy stuff for me. But that doesn't mean that once the book is out of sight, you're going to be able to talk intelligently about that content. So instead, what you want to do is actually what I just described is a great way of both seeing whether or not you've got the content and committing it to memory. Put the book away, try to talk about it as if you were teaching somebody. You can do this as you're reading. Especially, it's sort of an extra thing to do. So it might be something you want to do the second time through. Read a paragraph, look away, and then explain to somebody else the summary of that paragraph. Now, the downside of doing what I just did, the good thing about doing what I just described, it's a nice stepping stone, but it's probably not enough if you're studying for a test. The nice thing about it is you're putting it in your own words. You are having to call it up from memory. The downside is you just got finished reading it. So it's still sort of rattling around in working memory. Ultimately, you want to get to a place where you can do the same thing, summarize a chapter or a section when you haven't looked at that content in the last 30 minutes or so. So it turns out, and I'll be brief with this, it turns out that probing memory is actually a really good way to affix something that's in memory but is in sort of a fragile state. And students do test themselves, but they test themselves mostly to see whether or not they know something, see if they're done. They don't think of testing themselves as a way of trying to commit something to memory, but it's actually better than studying.
So that technique of probing memory, you say that you should allow about 30 minutes to elapse before you undertake that?
Yeah, if you're testing yourself for the purpose of committing something to memory, you don't need to wait 30 minutes. You can do that anytime. As long as the content's not right in front of you, you can do that, and it's going to help. If you want to know, do I really know something? Then you want to be sure that it's really fully cleared out of working memory. I say 30 minutes in the book. It might be, 20 might be fine. There's no fixed figure, but it should be a little while.
Okay, so you should let a little bit of time elapse before that.
Yeah.
And so we know that familiarity breeds contempt. Now we also know that familiarity is a deceitful friend. We must
it really is,
be on guard against familiarity for the reasons that you listed. Another thing on which against which we must be on guard is procrastination. I'm making a little bit of a jump here from those prescriptions on how we should best read to how we should get to reading and get to the projects before us. So it's one of the mental vices to which I know that I am hopelessly susceptible. And I'm sure if I know my audience, it's something against which they too are defenseless. So I console myself by remembering the words of the great 20th century American humorist Don Marquis, who cleverly reframed procrastination as the art of keeping up with yesterday. So in your book, you give advice on how procrastination might be combated. How do you combat procrastination, and how do you encourage others to do so?
I have a few different techniques that I use. Probably the most important, and the one that this is the long game. The most important is to make work truly a habit. And by that, I mean, habits are so powerful because procrastination happens when you are making a choice. Procrastination is the act of choosing, knowing I should probably do A and doing B instead. Usually because A sounds like it's going to be pretty unpleasant and B sounds a whole lot more pleasant. The sort of everyday understanding of why we would procrastinate aligns quite well with what researchers have found about why people procrastinate. You procrastinate because video games are fun and doing my chemistry problem set sounds like it's going to suck. So like, why wouldn't I play video games, right? So the great thing about habits is, if you've got the habit of flossing your teeth, you don't decide every night, should I floss or should I not floss? You just find yourself doing it. And so removing that choice is by far the best way to procrastinate. This is why I think I mentioned this in the book. Graduate schools, at least the graduate schools that I'm familiar with, faculty frequently have a slight preference for people who've actually been out of college, been in the working world for a year or two, because they know that 9 to 5 mindset. You don't decide, is it worth going to work today? And there are college students who sort of think, is it worth going to class? Should I go to class or not go to class? And that's death, right? That you can't have that in graduate school.
It's almost given the cost of attendance, it's almost unthinkable that that still is even an option. But yeah,
that's a whole other set of considerations. You're absolutely right. So I talk a little bit in the book about creating those sorts of habits, and there's been lots of work, and there's some great books on habits. And so I probably don't need to go into it in much depth with your audience, but the idea of chaining is, I think, very valid, sort of connecting it to something that you already do. But then some other ideas that might be new to your audience. One of the most powerful set of ideas actually comes out of exercise science. And studies showing that part of the reason we procrastinate is that the unpleasantness of the task is usually overestimated. So when you ask people, do you exercise? No, I don't like to exercise. Why? Oh, well, you get all sweaty and you feel terrible and so on. You bring them into the lab and you say, okay, you're going to be on this treadmill and this is how fast you're going to go. Scale of 1 to 10, after 15 minutes, how do you think you're going to feel? And people give their rating, and then they actually do it. And at the time, after 15 minutes, you say, okay, how do you feel? And what you find is people are like, this actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So one secret is to both recognize that and then also just start. If you can trick yourself into just starting something and eliminate, give yourself, and then one way to trick yourself is to give yourself permission to quit if you're really miserable. If this really stinks, I'll take a break. Like right now, my plan is I'm going to work for 20 minutes, then I'm going to have a 3-minute break. But you know what? If I'm hating this after 8 minutes, I'll let myself take the break right away. And of course, you have to follow through. You have to, if it really it doesn't work, if you're just telling yourself that, you have to actually give yourself permission to do that. But what you'll find is you frequently will keep going. Another thing you can do is reframe your choice. So anytime you procrastinate, you are actually giving up on the opportunity to feel good about having this task that you need to do hanging over your head. So sometimes I'll say to I'll have something that, do a journal article review I'm supposed to do, which I really don't want to do. But then the other thing I could do is prepare for class, which is really fun. Right. And that's, everyone's familiar with the idea of productive procrastination, where, I can't do anything until I clean up this desk, or I've got to bake some cookies now or clean my room or whatever it is. Right. So that's my version of productive procrastination, is preparing for class. So sometimes I tell myself,
that's far more productive than my procrastination. Yeah. I wish I could employ something as useful as that.
Well, I may be overestimating the frequency with which that's the task that I choose to productively procrastinate. But let's leave that alone, Daniel. I'm not the focus here. So what I'll do is I'll say to myself, okay, should I prepare for class, and then I will still have that article hanging over my head, or should I go ahead and knock off that article, give myself the opportunity, just sort of talk myself through what I'm actually giving up by procrastinating, which is the possibility of just having this unpleasant task over with. And then the last thing I'll mention is, I think everyone's familiar with the small bites idea, so there's no reason to get into that. But another idea that people might not be familiar with is the possibility that you're procrastinating as a way of self-handicapping. That if if there's something that I'm worried that even if I do try really hard at this, it's still not going to go very well. And so procrastination is a way of imposing a handicap on your performance so that, for example, if you're worried about a math test, you think you're not very good at math, then in the end, you'll be able to say, well, yeah, I didn't do very well in the test, but that's because I had no time to study, because I had all this other, I had to clean my room and bake brownies and all this other stuff. Or even if, you might berate yourself, oh my gosh, I'm terrible, I'm such a procrastinator. And therefore I had no time to study. So, think about that, just sit with that idea for a moment. There might be moments where you're self-handicapping. And procrastinate, that's the source of procrastination. And then that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think as I reflect on all of these means of procrastination that you just enumerated, I think I'm most guilty of the self-handicapping, actually. And I absolutely can remark upon multiple times during the course of a day, of a week, of a month, when I employ that technique unconsciously, right?
Yeah.
It's because of usually a lack of confidence in the outcome. If I'm uncertain about exactly what I'm doing, maybe it's in preparation for a podcast episode like this, or writing a script for some project on which I plan to be working, because I don't know exactly if the outcome will be as I wish it to be. I think that's when I begin to procrastinate. And though I'm not baking cookies nor brownies, I'm certainly doing things that are not in any way productive. I wanted to remark just briefly in response to some of the things that you said. You talked about habit formation, and of course there are techniques with which my audience will be generally familiar. But I was reminded when reading your book of James Clear's great book, the Atomic Habits. So for reference, if anyone needs that, pick up Mr. Clear's book and thumb through it. And he talks at length about habit stacking. So doing, maybe a thing that is less desirable after a thing that is more desirable, or maybe vice versa, in order to sort of encourage and reward yourself for having done it. And you mentioned another thing, which was the anticipatory aversion to doing something that you think will be unpleasant. Now, this reminds me, or maybe a remedy to this reminds me of the approach of the Stoics, which was sort of to, if I can use the term, kind of swallow a frog at the outset of every day. You almost want to mentally undergo the least pleasant thing possible. In that age, it was swallowing a frog. In this day and age, you can probably imagine your own. You want to do that immediately upon arising. Now, it's not the sort of jauntiest way to get up out of bed, but the purpose of so doing was to get that unpleasantness out of the way. So anything thereafter would be tolerable in comparison. And I always thought that's, again, not the most romantic way to get out of bed, but maybe useful in responding to the procrastination that accompanies that sense of aversion. Any thoughts about either of those two geniuses, one modern, one ancient, Aurelius or James Clear?
So yeah, well, I'll say I liked Clear's book very much, and I read it several years ago, so some of the details are lost to me. I will say what I remember thinking is that some of the psychology I would not agree with 1,000%, but like all of the advice I thought was really good. It's probably my favorite habits book. So yes, I agree with you. I think that's a good choice. When it comes to eating a frog, I mean, I think this is one of the things I tried. It's funny. That's a funny way to start a sentence. When it comes to eating a frog,
yes. What is your production technique? I should say. Let me interrupt. You include in the book a beautiful graphic of how to prepare, or the different ways in which you can prepare meat. Are you a carnivore? Are you a connoisseur of meats? Because I found that table to be really actually quite useful and
terrific. Yeah, I needed an example, and food. I like to cook, and so food science seemed a natural one. I don't talk about cooking a frog. If there's ever a second edition, I promise you.
In the appendix, we can add that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, there should be a few recipes. So I think that generally, one thing I'll add about the frog idea is that in addition to like it's sort of cognitive psychology would say you're resetting your baseline. It's like what's pleasant and unpleasant for the rest of the day. Everything's better than the frog. And so, if unpleasantness is rating, from 1 to 10, well, if the first thing I do is jog a mile, then that becomes like, oh, that was really unpleasant. Then even the frog's even worse, right? So it's like you sort of recalibrate your scale by eating the frog. The other thing I think it does for you is it may change your self-perception a little bit. It may, say like, you know what, I'm the kind of guy who, like, if there's a frog to be eaten, I just eat the damn frog right away. And like, I'm kind of a bad mother, I'm right. I'm pretty tough here. And so that really may kind of do something for your self-esteem and your self-image, and then make you more ready to take on whatever else comes your way during the day.
Yeah, let's just hope that you don't, in time, acquire a taste for the frog, and then the unpleasantness is blunted.
Yeah, I'm the wrong type of psychologist for that kind of thing.
Yeah, you'll need to seek somebody, some specialty. Right. So let's jump back to memory just for a moment. So you're famous for having described memory as the residue of thought, which is a wonderful image. I like to think of memory as like an invisible diary that we carry around everywhere with us, into which only a precious few thoughts are ever entered. So what do you mean when you describe memory as being the residue of thought?
What I essentially mean is that a lot of what's in memory, it's not essentially what I mean. An implication is that a lot of what's in memory is not precious. And this is what is so interesting about memory, is that it is so insensitive to our needs. And there are things that you really want to remember that you don't remember. And there are things that you don't care at all about remembering, various childhood advertising jingles and so on that do stick with you. And that's where memory is the residue of thought, is meant to sort of summarize that the most important factor in whether or not you remember something is the way in which you think about it at the time you experience it. Things that we think about deeply and deeply meaning, we think about the meaning of them, and we relate them to other things that we know. Those are the things that we're very likely to remember in the future. Things that we remember, things that we think about in kind of a shallow way, we're not very likely to remember. So the classic demonstration of this, which is due to a psychologist named Nickerson, is asking people to draw a penny. And if you ask people, do you know what a penny looks like? They'll of course say yes. And if you ever want to have some fun with a group of people, pass out pieces of paper with a circle on each piece of paper and say, here's a pen, draw me what a penny looks like. And the results are hilarious. People can't remember which way Lincoln faces.
Do you even think that your students now could even would even know that Lincoln is on a penny? I mean, I don't know how many students of a certain age who have even interacted physically with a solid penny.
Well, it's a great point. That right? Who uses? How much do we use cash now? So you can do a different demonstration with students, which is where the letters are on a phone dial. So where is the J on a phone dial? Anyway, what that's meant to show is repetition, which is what we usually think of as being super important for memory, is important for memory, but it's not everything. If you never think about like which way Lincoln faces and what is printed on the penny and where is the date, if you never think about that, it does not matter how many times a penny is in your gaze. It's not going to stick with you. You have to think about what things mean in order to remember them. But you don't have to want to remember anything. As long as you're thinking about what it means, you'll remember, whether you intend to remember or not.
Yeah, and you're emphatic on that point in your book about meaning and the importance of meaning in ensuring memories. It's so funny because there are so many things of which I have vivid memories, but to which I gave, at the time, absolutely no deliberate thought. like you said, childhood jingles,
Yeah.
little songs. Tell me, what is one memory that you have, maybe from your youth, that is absolutely insignificant? You wish that it didn't occupy any space in your brain, but it does.
Yeah.
Get it out.
I mean, I think advertising jingles are a good example, and it's not completely understood why music makes things so memorable. It probably is providing, I mean, this would get more technical than your audience would be interested in. It's probably providing some extra cues at the time you're trying to dredge something out of memory. But yeah, the Bumblebee tuna jingle from the 70s, like I could live without that, really, occupying space in my, there is that feeling, especially like, yeah, I just turned 62 yesterday. So you start to think, thank you. You start to think about aging, right? And you're like, well, we got so many neurons left, and the damn tuna song is like taking up 6.
And then you have the mercury from the tuna,
oh my gosh, it's a whole thing.
So would you be willing to sing for us?
No, I absolutely would not.
Because I don't know the Bumblebee tuna song. I'm trying to think.
Well, I'm sure it's on YouTube.
Oh, I'm sure it is. Yeah, that's not really widely advertised nowadays. I can't tell you the last time I've seen a tuna commercial. Oh man, I can think of there was an auto parts store called O'Reilly. I don't know.
Yeah,
I think.
O'Reilly.
You have a wonderful voice. Yeah, so it was the O'Reilly, auto parts. Again, that the space in my brain is precious, and so many other things could probably fit into that little pin-sized area where O'Reilly is reigning with an ironclad grip, but
won't give up.
He won't be removed. So again, the memory as the residue of thought, things that you want to remember or don't want to remember. Sometimes it doesn't really matter. I want to turn now to following your passion and following your purpose. This is something about which you talk toward the end of your book. Yeah. So as a beloved professor at the University of Virginia, a fact to which countless 5-star reviews on your Rate My Professor page will attest. I scanned them earlier today. I'm sure that many students seek you for advice on their careers. Now, I have no doubt that the majority of these students has been told at some point in their lives that they should simply follow their passion, right? But you tell them, or I assume you tell them that maybe that's not the best way to go about choosing and pursuing a career or a life. You differentiate between following one's passion and following one's purpose. So can you maybe expand on that differentiation and that idea a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. And there's been some brilliant work by a number of social psychologists on this in the last 5 years or so. And the distinction is exactly as you described. Passion sounds like exactly what you expect it to be, that it's something that you care deeply about and feel strongly about. And most often it's associated with, feeling a lot of pleasure in undertaking the activity. So, people are passionate about playing a musical instrument, or passionate about acting, or passionate about chemistry, or whatever it is. But when you look at the research on happiness with career choice and the extent to which people day to day feel satisfied, purpose is a much better predictor. So feeling that you are contributing to something larger than yourself, that's what makes people feel really good about what they do day to day. And I think beautiful example of this is that there are people who are in professions that to outsiders sound, candidly kind of terrible. Like the one that always sticks with me is when in an emergency room, surgery unit, where everyone comes bustling in and there's been a horrible accident, and people are throwing gauze and just like it's making a horrible mess, and their bodily fluids and blood and on the floor and so on. Someone has to come in and clean that up and make it sterile for the next person. the next operation. And researchers have talked with the people who do this work. And of course, if you really, really hate it, you're not going to be in that job. But the people who are in it actually report feeling very strongly about it and very positively. And it's not, once they say why, it's very easy to understand. They see themselves as part of the team, as of course they are. And it's easy to discount, like not even think about the fact, like you're focused on the doctors and nurses who are in there saving the life, and you're not thinking about all the people who support the doctors and nurses. But this person understands, I'm a critical part of this team. And what a purpose-driven profession that is. So that's and it does also, I think, give you a slightly different spin on when you think about passion. Passion may be something of a guide, but frequently the reason passion is a guide is because it's correlated with purpose. If you're very passionate about something, you want everyone else to understand how wonderful this is. Like, we should all appreciate oboe music or whatever it is, right? You want to share that with the world.
Yeah, and that was my intuition when I was reading your book, and I think you basically you explained that. You explained it beautifully just now, but I think you explained it also very well in the book, that there is some, they're not inextricable. Your passion in many ways motivates your purpose. You mentioned that. I mean, the role of the orderly or the tech who's working in that emergency room, that blood-stained emergency room, is a relatively unglamorous figure. George Clooney won't be portraying him on ER, or any other square-jawed, handsome actor won't be the orderly who's on his hands and knees and scrubbing away the whatever it is, the bacterial infection that oozed out of a wound, but is as integral to the collectivity, to the team, as any other member. Let me ask you, if you find as a listener or as an audience member, if you find yourself in a position that you feel is maybe beneath you, or I don't know, not quite to your liking, is there a way to trick yourself into feeling purposeful in that role from a psychological standpoint?
That's a great question, and candidly, it's not one I've thought about before. It feels like there ought to be, but I don't know of any research on that subject, if it exists. Certainly, it would be worth just trying to be mindful of that and thinking, what happens if I'm not here? Like, here I am doing this thing I don't really want to do. What would happen if I and everybody else just topped out and said, well, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to clean this ER floor. This is terrible. That might help you think more productively about your role as a team member. I think also it is a very individual thing. I mean, I think there are things that, like, I could not see myself doing that job. I totally understand the mindset intellectually, but like, that wouldn't be me. I think there are things that I do that are, I hate to say comparable, but there are things that likewise other people would never want to do at a smaller scale that make sense for me, that I see myself like I'm competent in this area. I mean, again, like I'm sheepish raising it because we've given I don't want to, turn this mythical cleaner of an emergency room into a saint, right? That's sort of going too much in the other direction. I also feel weird, like comparing myself to, anyway, you get the idea. But there are things I do at work that are, voluntary, that other people just don't want to do, and for which I don't get any, reward really, other than feeling like this is important. Like, somebody should be doing this. Like, students will really benefit if someone does this, so I'm going to do it. And other people do other things. So I think that's the other way to think about it is, pick your spots, and maybe the thing you're doing right now that you're trying to talk yourself into, if it is optional, maybe it's not for you. Like, maybe there's something else that plays more to your strengths that would be a better way to make a contribution.
Yeah, that's excellent advice, and it's a really intriguing prospect. This idea of maybe trying to deceive yourself into a purposeful occupation or living into that world of purpose, because I think increasingly, I think we've known this, maybe almost in a pre-scientific traditional way, but we know that a purpose-driven life is going to lead to human flourishing. And I think now we're seeing quite the opposite, which is the loss of purpose in a lot of different ways, the loss of purpose in careers and lives and families. Again, this is a deeper conversation that we don't need to pursue, but I see so many connections between your work and the works of other psychologists, popular psychologists that I've read, and in conjunction with traditional wisdom that we all imbibe and we absorb from the great books and from the past and from our heritage. That purpose is really core. It has to be fundamental to what we do and to who we are, and only in that way, I think, will we achieve flourishing.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I think it's very timely. I mean, I think times of turmoil are times that make us question, why am I here? What is my contribution? What direction are we all headed? And I think it's fair to say these are times of turmoil.
Yeah, undoubtedly, with all the shootings and all of the carnage and all of the difficult situations in which we find ourselves, I agree completely. So let me ask you, if, sort of on that note, if for maybe 30 seconds time you had the attention of every American student, high school or college aged, what is the advice you might give to them, to that population?
Yeah, I would say persist, because you're capable of much more than you think you are, but it is difficult. Don't kid yourself. And anybody who tells you there's a way that you can become good at something, become knowledgeable without working hard, has got something to sell you. That said, you can become very good at something. You can become very knowledgeable, not only about something, but about lots of things. It takes work, and work, like anything else, is a skill that you acquire. It gets the hard work becomes easier as you stick with it, but it's worth it.
So persistence. And to those who feel as though they are maybe intellectually deficient, or maybe they feel as though they're not quite smart enough, what would you say to them?
I would say first of all, everybody feels that way sometimes. Second of all, everybody's smart at some stuff and not so smart at other stuff. The third thing I would say is, and this is by far the most important, no matter how smart or not very smart you are, you can always be smarter. Everybody is always focused on the other people for whom it seems easier. And it doesn't matter how accomplished that person is, there's always somebody who they perceive to be ahead of them. And when you put it that way, it's sort of obvious. It's completely unproductive. The only thing that matters, the only comparison that matters, is where you are today relative to where you were last week and where you want to be next week. And you can always improve yourself.
Yeah, and one of the best ways that you can improve yourself is to pick up Dan's fine book, Outsmart Your Brain.
Well, I hardly.
En route.
Not where I was going with that, Daniel, but if you want to bring it up.
Oh, undoubtedly, because, like you said, along with persisting, you need to move in a direction strategically, and I think by implementing your advice, you'll be able to do that. I think I read a Twitter follower of yours who said, "Man, I wish that I had this book 28 years ago when I was in school." And though I'm not quite 28 years removed from school, I share that wish. I mean, I wish that I had this information at my hands. I hope it gets into a large portion of the American student body's hands, because I think it will be of absolute invaluable importance to everybody who's trying to be a little bit smarter, to be a little bit more intelligent, and not to measure him or herself against the mass of humanity. So one more question before we depart, and you've been very generous with your time. while scanning the many laudatory comments on your Rate My Professor page, I noticed a remark that was oft repeated, that you're an accomplished teller of jokes, or at least a funnier than average professor. So is the introduction of humor in the classroom strategic, or as a means to by which to enhance learning, or is it just your personality bursting through and making itself known?
It's personality. I'm a jokey person. I think it's certainly partly by design to try and keep the atmosphere in the classroom a little bit lighter. I will tell you, when I first started teaching, I tried very hard to restrain myself from telling jokes, because I found, and maybe it was to do with my age, I don't know, but I found that they did not land as often. It may have also just been like my lack of confidence. I don't know. Maybe I was less funny then, God knows. But I tell my students now, the graduate students who are preparing for teaching, I tell them, it's probably best not to tell a lot of jokes, because if they don't, first of all, a lot of students will think something's funny. Actually, I remember that now that you bring it up. I remember, on occasion when I would tell jokes, people saying like, oh, he's so funny, oh, this and that. And I'm like, why don't you freaking laugh during class? Like, no, when you sat there like nothing. And like, it is so dispiriting to like tell a joke and just nothing happens. And I think part of it is people feel a little inhibited, they don't want to be the only one laughing or whatever. Mm-hmm. So anyway, sorry, long answer to your question, but the answer is, it's a personality thing.
Oh, it's a perfect answer. And I detected that it was a personality thing from the moment we hit record. I felt compelled to ask the question nonetheless. So Dan, you've been, like I said, extraordinarily generous with your time. I want to give you a moment to impart any last little bit of wisdom to our audience that you might have reserved, and maybe tell us the social media sites or the websites on which we can reach and follow you.
Sure. So I don't know that I have any wisdom that would, I want to strike down like a C major chord at the end here. But yeah, I can be found on DT Willingham, Daniel Thompson Willingham, that is. So it's DT Willingham. That's Facebook and Twitter. And then TikTok, I'm Daniel_Willingham, if that's your platform.
Very good. Yeah. And like I said, I visited the Twitter account. It's very lively, very active, very fun. You'll certainly learn something and have a good laugh, I think, along the way. So I think that just about does it for us today. I want to thank you again and extend to you my infinite gratitude for joining me on this humble little channel. I hope that it was worthwhile. I hope that the interchange of ideas was stimulating. And to my audience out there, again, small though you may be at this point, I thank each and every one of you. I just want to let you know that we're trying to have just great conversations with a multitude of people, and Dan absolutely provided that today. A wonderful conversation from which I really learned a lot. So with that, I bid you farewell from Finneran's Wake.